The day Helen Wells read a book during the Sunday sermon was the day the whole town of Redrock, Texas, decided she had gone completely and irreparably mad. It was the spring of 1878, and Redrock was the kind of town that had opinions about everything. The way a woman wore her hair, the hour a man chose to water his horses, and most especially, what a young, unmarried woman of 23 ought to be doing with her afternoons. The answer, as far as Redrock was concerned, was absolutely not reading. Not novels, not histories, not almanacs, and certainly not the thick leather-bound volume of collected poems that Helen tucked under her arm every single morning as though it were as necessary as her heartbeat. She had brown hair the color of saddle leather, worn in a loose braid that was perpetually coming undone, and gray eyes that held the particular kind of steadiness that made people uncomfortable because they could never quite tell what she was thinking. She lived in the small house at the edge of town that her father, Thomas Wells, had left her when he passed 3 winters ago, a surveyor who had never minded that his daughter preferred the company of books to the company of neighbors. He had been the one who stacked her shelves full of Dickens and Emerson and Whitman, and every newspaper he could lay hands on when he came back from his work trips to San Antonio and Austin. And he had been the one who told her that a mind that stopped asking questions had already begun to die. Thomas Wells had been a forward-thinking man in a backward-leaning town, and when he died of fever in December of 1875, he left Helen the house, a small amount of money held by the bank in town, and a collection of books that was more valuable to her than every acre of land in Redrock County. Helen supported herself by taking in sewing and mending, which she did at her kitchen table with a book propped open beside her thimble and thread. She could finish a hem and read 3 pages simultaneously, a skill that impressed no one in Redrock because no one in Redrock thought reading was a skill worth having, at least not for a woman who was already past 20 and not yet married. "She is going to end up alone," said Millicent Pryor to her sister Agnes at the dry goods store on a Tuesday in April, not particularly lowering her voice. "A woman who cares more for books than people will find that books do not keep a house warm in winter." Helen, who was standing 2 feet away examining a bolt of calico, heard every word. She smiled pleasantly, purchased her calico, and walked home to finish the chapter she had been reading in great expectations, which she thought was one of the finest things a human being had ever put to paper. The town's judgment had never particularly wounded her, but she would have been dishonest if she said it never stung. There were evenings when the small house felt very quiet indeed, and when she sat on the porch watching the sun drop behind the flat horizon, she felt the particular loneliness of a person who loves deeply but has no one nearby who speaks the same language. She loved the red dirt of Texas, the enormous empty sky, the way the wind moved through the mesquite trees in long, slow waves. She just also loved Tennyson, and the problem was that Redrock did not know what to do with both of those things existing in the same woman. She had her friendships, Margaret Aldine, who ran the millinery shop and never judged her, and old Doc Prentice, who had a fondness for Mark Twain and occasionally left a new volume on her porch as though the books arrived by some mysterious frontier wind. These were good friendships, real ones, and they mattered to her. But the deeper longing, the one she admitted to no one, was for someone who would sit beside her and not be made uneasy by the silence of reading, someone who would ask her what she thought about what she had read, someone who would look at the packed shelves in her front room and see not eccentricity but richness. She had decided, sometime in the winter of 1877, that such a person probably did not exist in Redrock. She had made a quiet peace with that conclusion. She had her books, her work, her small porch, and her enormous Texas sky. And then Marcus Walden rode into Redrock on a gray April morning with a split lip, a tired horse, and 3 months of trail dust on his coat. He came in with a cattle drive from the west, the Dunmore outfit, 12 men and 1,000 head of longhorns that needed to pass through on the way to the railhead at Abilene. They were expected. Ranchers and trail bosses had been using the Redrock corridor for years, and the town knew how to accommodate the business. The general store stocked up. The livery made space. The one saloon, called the Broken Spur, cleaned its glasses and laid in extra whiskey. Marcus Walden was the Dunmore Outfit's trail boss, and he was 28 years old, tall and wide-shouldered in the way of a man who had spent his entire adult life in physical labor, with dark eyes and a serious face that had been weathered by the sun into something that stopped just short of handsome and landed instead on striking. He had a scar on his right hand from a branding iron accident at 19, and calluses so thick on his palms that he sometimes felt as though he were touching the world through a layer of cloth. He had grown up poor in Missouri, the third son of a farmer who could barely read his own name, and had come west at 17 with $2 and a willingness to work that no one could fault. He had been on cattle drives every year since he was 18, had learned the land, learned the animals, learned to read whether the way other men read newspapers. He had never himself learned to read very much at all. This was the part that Marcus Walden did not discuss. It was not that he was entirely illiterate. He could make out simple words, could sign his name with confidence, could puzzle through a bill of sale given enough time. But a full page of close-set type defeated him in a way that he found deeply and privately shameful. He had never been in a school long enough for it to stick. On the trail, this was easy enough to hide. A trail boss needed to read the land, not the books. But it sat in him like a stone, that gap, particularly on winter evenings when the other men read letters from home aloud to each other, and he sat apart and pretended he was simply tired. His first interaction with Helen Wells was entirely accidental and not particularly promising. He was crossing the main street of Redrock on his way to arrange supplies at the general store, and he was not watching where he was going because he was watching a pair of longhorns that one of his younger hands was managing badly at the far end of the street. Helen was coming out of the post office with a brown paper parcel that had the unmistakable shape of a book, and they walked squarely into each other. The parcel hit the ground. The book slid halfway out of its wrapping. "Pardon me," Marcus said immediately, bending to pick it up. Helen was already crouching for it too, and they nearly knocked their heads together, and she pulled back and looked up at him with those steady gray eyes and said, "It is all right. I should have been watching my footing." He handed her the parcel, and she checked that the book was unharmed with the kind of attention most people gave to injured animals, smoothing the paper back into place with careful fingers. "Good book?" he asked, because it was the only thing that came to mind. "I hope so," she said. "I have not started it yet. It is Middlemark by George Eliot." He had no idea what either of those things were, and his face must have shown it because she added, not unkindly, "A novel. Just arrived from the bookseller in Austin." You had it sent from Austin. He was surprised more by the logistics than the fact of it. Austin was a long way for a book to travel. "Redrock does not have a bookshop," she said simply, as though this were a regrettable but straightforward fact, which it was. "I have an arrangement with a bookseller there. He sends me things he thinks I will want." Marcus looked at her for a moment, at the earnest certainty with which she held that parcel, at the loose braid and the direct gaze, and then nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and continued across the street. He had cattle to account for, and a list of supplies to arrange, and no particular reason to think further about a young woman with a book sent all the way from Austin. But something small and stubborn had lodged in the back of his mind, and he did not quite examine what it was. The Dunmore outfit would be in Redrock for 4 days, resting the herd before the final push north. It was enough time for the town to take the measure of the men, and for the men to take the measure of the town. Marcus kept his outfit orderly. He had a strict rule against his men drinking to the point of trouble, and he enforced it without negotiation. This had earned him a reputation among ranchers and town merchants alike as a man worth dealing with, and Redrock's mayor, A stout man named Gerald Fitz shook his hand on the second morning and told him he was welcome back any time. On the second afternoon, Marcus was sitting on the bench outside the livery, checking through a supply ledger that his foreman's assistant had filled in, working through it word by slow word with the quiet effort it always required. He was so focused that he did not hear anyone approach until a shadow fell across the page. He looked up. It was Helen Wells. She had a basket over one arm. She had been delivering mending to someone on this side of town, and she had stopped without quite meaning to, he could tell, because she looked faintly startled at herself. "I am sorry," she said. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You did not," he said. He closed the ledger, an instinct he could not have fully explained except that he did not like being watched while he struggled through words. She glanced at the ledger, then back at him. "I am Helen Wells. I live at the end of Sycamore Street." She said it the way a person says something practical without performance. "Marcus Walden," he said, "trail boss for the Dunmore outfit." "I know. The whole town knows. 1,000 longhorns are difficult to overlook." He almost smiled. "They are." She shifted her basket and seemed about to move on, but then she paused, with a small crease between her brows that he would later come to recognize as the particular expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say something she was not sure was her business. "The ledger," she said. "If it is difficult to get through, I am happy to help. I have an hour before I need to start supper." There was nothing unkind in the offer. She said it the way she might offer to hold a door, matter of fact, without pity. But Marcus felt heat climb the back of his neck anyway, and his first instinct was to refuse. "I manage fine," he said, and the words came out more clipped than he intended. She nodded. "Of course," she said easily, and moved off down the street without making anything of it. He watched her go and felt like an idiot for the sharpness he had not been able to hold back, and also like a fool for the odd small ache of wishing she had stayed a little longer. That evening at the Broken Spur, his foreman, a lanky 35-year-old named Pete Calhoun who had ridden with him for 4 years, mentioned Helen Wells with the casual cruelty of a man passing along town gossip he found amusing. "The woman with the books," Pete said, tipping his whiskey glass. "They say she is peculiar, has a whole room full of them, reads at all hours." He shook his head with the mild bewilderment of a man encountering a foreign custom. "Not right that many books for one person." "Why not?" Marcus asked. Pete looked at him. "What do you mean, why not?" "Why is it not right?" Pete shrugged. "Women who read too much get ideas," he said, which was apparently the entire argument. Marcus said nothing. He finished his drink and thought about Helen Wells standing in the afternoon sun with her basket, making her offer without a shred of condescension, and thought that getting ideas seemed like a perfectly reasonable thing for a person to do. On the third morning, something happened that Marcus had not planned and could not quite account for. He had woken early and walked the edge of town in the blue pre-dawn, which was his habit. He liked the land in the early morning before it belonged to everyone. He ended up on Sycamore Street without particularly intending to, and he saw a light in the window of the last house. Helen Wells was already up, already reading, the lamp making a warm square of gold in the gray morning. He stood there for probably longer than was dignified, watching that square of lamplight, and then he made himself walk back to the livery before anyone could catch him standing in the street like a man who had lost his purpose. The drive was leaving the next morning. He had exactly 1 day left in Redrock. At noon, Helen was at the dry goods store, and Marcus walked in 3 minutes after her, needing salt blocks. It was Millicent Pryor's dry goods store, and Millicent Pryor watched the two of them with the avid attention of a woman who considered other people's business her primary vocation. Helen was in the corner with a worn copy of something. She had brought a book to read while she waited for her order to be assembled, which Marcus suspected was the sort of thing that drove Millicent Pryor to distraction, and Marcus found himself drifting toward her with no convincing excuse for doing so. "Middlemark?" he asked, looking at the cover. She looked up, surprised. "No, this is a different one. Middlemark is at home. This is Jane Eyre. I have read it several times." She turned it to show him the spine. "Do you always bring a book when you are waiting?" he asked. "I always bring a book when I go anywhere," she said. "Waiting time is reading time. It seems wasteful to let it go by empty." He pulled up the crate across from her that served as the store's informal seating, and he sat down, which surprised both of them. "What is it about?" he asked. "Jane Eyre." She looked at him steadily for a moment, as though measuring whether he was asking to be polite or asking because he wanted to know. Something in what she found must have satisfied her, because she settled back against the shelf and said, "It is about a woman who has very little in the world, no family, no money, no beauty by the conventional standard, who nonetheless refuses to be made small by those circumstances. She has a tremendous dignity in her. And she falls in love with a man who is complicated and difficult and not always good, and the love between them is real enough that it survives things that should rightly destroy it." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it end well?" "Yes," she said, and the way she said it was warm, as though the ending still made her glad even after multiple readings. "It ends very well." Millicent Pryor was watching them with wide eyes from behind the counter, and Marcus did not care even slightly. "I leave tomorrow," he said. "I know," she said. "The whole town is already talking about how quiet it will be when the herd moves on." "I will be back through in the fall," he said. "Dunmore runs the same corridor south after the sale at Abilene." She looked at him again with that measuring gaze. "That is a long time to be on the trail. I am used to it. Do you like it?" No one had asked him that in years. He thought about it honestly. "Some of it," he said. "The open land, the sky, the way you can go a whole day without seeing another person if you pick the right route." He paused. "The lonesome parts I have less fondness for." Something shifted in her expression, a small softening that she probably did not know was visible. "I understand that," she said quietly. Millicent Pryor called from the counter that Helen's order was ready, and the moment broke, and Helen stood and gathered her parcel and her book, and she looked at him one last time with those gray eyes, and she said, "Safe travels, Mr. Walden." "Thank you, Miss Wells," he said. She walked out of the dry goods store and into the April sunlight, and Marcus sat on that crate for probably 30 seconds longer than made any sense, feeling the particular loss of a thing that had not quite had the chance to begin. He left Redrock the next morning with 1,000 head of longhorns and the memory of a lamplight square in a gray dawn, and he carried both of those things north through Oklahoma territory and into Kansas with an attentiveness that made Pete Calhoun ask him twice if he was feeling all right. "Fine," Marcus said both times, which was not precisely true. The months on the trail were long and not without incident. They lost 4 steers crossing the Cimarron after unexpected rain swelled the banks, and one of his younger hands, a 19-year-old named Bobby Trent, broke 2 ribs when his horse spooked and threw him in the night. Marcus got the boy to a doctor in Dodge City, paid for the visit out of his own wages, and put Bobby in a wagon for the last stretch to Abilene. The boy healed well and was grateful in the earnest way of young men who have not yet learned to expect kindness. At Abilene, the cattle sold well, and Dunmore was satisfied and paid every man his due. Marcus took his wages, settled his accounts, and signed on for the fall return south, which was the plan he had held in his mind since April in a way that had very little to do with cattle. He told himself it was practical. He told himself the corridor through Redrock was simply the best route. He told himself this every day through August while he worked a smaller summer job near Wichita and tried not to think about a woman reading Jane Eyre by lamplight. He also did something in Wichita that he had never done before. He hired a school teacher. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Cross, a widow of 40 who ran a small education program for the children of local workers, and Marcus went to her on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and told her plainly that he was a grown man of 28 who could not read properly and that he would like to learn. He had enough money to pay her fairly, he said. He had the summer. He was willing to work. Mrs. Cross, who had seen a great many things in her life and was not easily surprised, looked him up and down and said, "Well then, sit down. We will start with the alphabet." He had never worked harder at anything. Mrs. Cross was patient but not indulgent, and she assigned him reading exercises every evening that he sat up with long after dark, mouthing the words quietly, the way Bobby Trent probably mouthed his prayers. He read simple texts first, farm ledgers, almanac entries, basic newspaper columns, and then longer things, articles, then stories. The reading did not come easily, and some evenings he stared at the page until his eyes burned and felt the old shame rising. And then he thought about Helen Wells sitting on the floor of Millicent Pryor's dry goods store, describing a book she had read several times with the warmth of someone describing a beloved friend, and he went back to the page. By September, he could read a full newspaper column without stopping. By October, when the Dunmore outfit reformed for the return south, he could read at a decent pace, stumbling only on longer, unfamiliar words. Mrs. Cross had given him a book to take with him, a thin collected volume of short stories, and told him to read a page every night regardless of how tired he was. He did. The outfit came south through Kansas, and then Oklahoma Territory and into Texas in October, when the prairie grass had gone golden, and the sky was the deep, relentless blue of the southern autumn. Marcus knew the day they crossed into Redrock County, and he felt something tighten in his chest that had no business making itself known to anyone else, so he kept his expression neutral and his eyes on the herd, and rode at the front where a trail boss was supposed to be. They reached Redrock on the 16th of October, 1878. Helen Wells was at the well at the edge of Sycamore Street when the herd came through, because half the town was out watching the herd come through. 1,000 cattle and 12 dusty cowboys were not a subtle arrival. She had a bucket in each hand, and she was watching the drive with the same interested calm with which she approached most things. Marcus saw her from horseback before she saw him. He was unreasonably glad that he had gotten his hair cut in Dodge City. He guided his horse to the edge of the road and touched his hat. "Miss Wells." She looked up, and he watched recognition move across her face, followed by something else, something warmer that she did not entirely suppress. "Mr. Walden," she said, "you made it back." "I said I would," he said. "People say a great many things," she replied, but she was almost smiling. "How is Middlemark?" he asked. She looked startled, then pleased. "Magnificent," she said. "One of the best novels I have ever read." "Good," he said. "I will want to hear about it." He rode on before she could answer, because the herd needed managing, and he was already garnering curious looks from Pete Calhoun, who had a talent for noticing things that were not his business. But he looked back once, and she was still watching him, the buckets in her hands, the afternoon light on her face, and something about that image settled into him like the resolution of a chord he had not known was incomplete. He called on her the following afternoon. He went to her house on Sycamore Street with his hat in hand and his shirt clean and knocked on the door. And when she opened it, she looked at him with those steady gray eyes and waited. "I told you I would want to hear about Middlemark," he said, "if the offer stands." She studied him for a moment. "I could tell you about it," she said slowly, "or you could hear it for yourself." She stepped back from the door. "Come in, Mr. Walden." The front room of her house was exactly as he had imagined it would be, which meant he had been imagining it. Shelves on every wall, full of books arranged with care, some by color, some by size, some, he suspected, by subject. A reading chair by the window, worn smooth with use. A small table with a lamp. A braided rug on the wooden floor. It smelled of lamp oil and old paper, and something faintly floral, lavender, he thought. She gestured to the chair at the table and took the reading chair herself, and she picked up Middlemark from the side table where it sat with a folded paper marking her place, and she said, "I will read you from the beginning so you have the context. Is that all right?" "That is fine," he said, and Helen Wells opened the book and began to read. She read well. He had suspected she would, but the reality of it surpassed the expectation. Her voice was clear and measured, and she gave the words room to be themselves without theatrical excess, and the story came through it with a surprising vividness. a rural English county. A young woman named Dorothea who wanted more from life than her circumstances permitted, the small tyrannies of social expectation. Marcus listened with his hat on his knee and his eyes on her face, and by the end of the first chapter, he was genuinely interested in what happened to Dorothea. "She reminds me of you a little," he said when Helen paused. Helen looked up. "Dorothea. She wants more than the place she is in will give her," he said. "She has something larger in her than where she is." Helen was quiet for a moment, looking at the page. "I have never thought of it that way," she said finally. "But perhaps you are right." He stayed for 2 hours that afternoon. He did not tell her about Wichita or Mrs. Cross or the slow, painful summer of learning to read, not yet. He just listened to her read and asked questions at the natural pauses, and drank the coffee she made without being asked, and which was better than anything he had tasted since Missouri. And when he finally stood to go, the evening had come in around the windows and he had not noticed until it was dark. "I have taken too much of your time," he said. "You have not," she said simply. He was back the next afternoon. Redrock noticed immediately. Redrock always noticed immediately. It was a town with 1,100 residents and very little happening on any given Tuesday, and a trail boss calling on Helen Wells was more interesting than most things that October. Millicent Pryor told her sister Agnes within the day. Margaret Aldine at the millinery smiled to herself and said nothing to anyone. Pete Calhoun said to Marcus, with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned not to push, "You have been disappearing every afternoon." "I have been calling on someone," Marcus said. "The reading woman," Pete said. "Her name is Helen Wells," Marcus said, "and yes." Pete considered this for a moment, then apparently decided it was not worth the argument and went back to mending his tack. Each afternoon for the 4 days remaining to the Dunmore outfit's stay in Redrock, Marcus went to Helen's house on Sycamore Street and sat in the chair at her table and listened to her read. They went through the first 3 chapters of Middlemarch, and then, at his request, she pulled out Jane Eyre, because he wanted to hear the book she had described in the dry goods store back in April, and she read him the beginning while he listened with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the window where the October light fell golden through the glass. But they did not only listen and read. Between the chapters, they talked. She asked him about the trail, not politely, not the way people ask to fill silence, but with real curiosity about how the land looked in Kansas, how you managed 1,000 animals through a river crossing, how you navigated by stars when the trail was unfamiliar. He answered with the same directness she used, none of the hedging he usually applied when talking to people he did not know well, and found that talking to her was as easy as some things that should have been easier. He told her about growing up in Missouri, the farm, the 3 brothers, the poverty that was not dramatic but was constant and grinding, the way he had left at 17 because staying would have made him something smaller than he wanted to be. He did not tell her about the reading yet, but he told her everything else, things he had not said aloud to anyone in years. She told him about her father, about the books he had brought her, about the loneliness of being different in a place that valued sameness highly. She said it without bitterness as a fact, and the absence of bitterness impressed him more than almost anything. "Does it bother you," he asked, "what the town says about you?" She thought about it honestly, which he was learning was her way. She did not give quick, easy answers. "It used to hurt more," she said. "Now it is mostly just noise. I have my work, my friendships, my books." She paused. "The loneliness bothers me more than the judgment." "What kind of loneliness?" he asked. She looked at the fire in the grate for a moment. "The kind where you have something important to you and no one around you understands why it matters," she said. "You understand the land, the trail, the way you describe the stars over Oklahoma territory. If you told that to most people here, they would nod and move on. That is the loneliness I mean." "Yes," he said. "I know exactly what you mean." They looked at each other across her small, warm room, and the October wind moved in the mesquite trees outside, and neither of them said anything else about it. But both of them understood that something had just been named that did not need to be named a second time to be true. On the last evening before the outfit moved on, he came later than usual because he had been dealing with a billing dispute with the general store, and she had already lit the lamp against the early dark. She opened the door before he knocked, which meant she had been listening for his step, and neither of them commented on this. They finished the third chapter of Jane Eyre and she closed the book, and he did not move to get his hat and she did not tell him the evening was late. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "In the spring, when you offered to help me with the ledger," he said slowly, "I was not honest with you. It was not that I managed fine. I could barely get through it." She looked at him steadily. Could not read properly," he said. "I never had the schooling. I could manage simple things but not a full page of text." He looked at the table. "I spent the summer in Wichita with a school teacher, a widow named Mrs. Cross, learning," he paused, "because of you." The silence stretched. He made himself hold his chin up and meet her gaze. "Because of me?" she said finally. "You described Jane Eyre in the dry goods store," he said. "A woman who refuses to be made small. You said the ending was very well." He paused again. "I wanted to be able to read the ending for myself." Helen Wells looked at him for a long moment, and then something happened in her face that she could not quite contain, a brightness that moved through her gray eyes like sunlight on water. She reached to the shelf beside her and took down the copy of Jane Eyre, and she held it out to him. "Then take it with you," she said. "Read the ending. And come back and tell me what you thought of it." He took the book. His hand brushed hers in the exchange and neither of them moved apart quickly. "I will come back in the spring," he said. "I will be here," she said. He rode out of Redrock the next morning with Jane Eyre in his saddlebag and something in his chest that he thought, with the tentative wondering of a man who has not allowed himself to hope often, might be the beginning of the happiest thing that had ever happened to him. He read the book on the trail, 10 pages a night as Mrs. Cross had prescribed, sometimes by firelight, sometimes by the early dawn before the camp stirred. The other men noticed Marcus Walden sitting up late with a book was unusual enough to comment on, but he did not explain, and his expression was forbidding enough that no one pushed. Pete Calhoun looked at the cover once and said nothing, which Marcus respected him for. He finished Jane Eyre in late November, by firelight in the camp south of San Antonio. He sat for a long time after he read the final words, listening to the fire and the distant sound of the cattle, and thought about Dorothea from Middlemark, and about Helen's voice reading the words, and about a woman who believed in the power of stories to say true things about the world. He wrote her a letter. He had never written a letter in his life that was not a bill of sale or a work agreement, and this was harder than either of those by a considerable margin. But he sat with a page of paper and a pencil for an hour in the camp, and wrote out slowly and carefully what he thought of Jane Eyre's ending and what the book had made him feel, and he posted it from San Antonio and hoped it arrived before the winter closed in. Helen received it in December. She was at her kitchen table when Margaret Aldine brought it by, having seen it at the post office and knowing it was not the shape of anything from the bookseller in Austin. Helen looked at the handwriting on the outside, large and careful, the letters a little uneven, the writing of a man still learning the muscle memory of it, and she pressed her hand flat against the envelope for a moment before she opened it. The letter was 3 pages, which was 4 times what she had expected. He wrote about the ending of Jane Eyre with the particular vividness of a person for whom a story is new. The way the reunion struck him, the way the equality between the two characters felt earned and real, the way it seemed to him that love done right was not a diminishment of a person, but the only thing that made the fullest version of them possible. He wrote about the prairie in November, the way frost came to the grass and turned it silver in the early morning. He wrote that he was thinking about the spring with more particular attention than he usually gave to any season. He closed by asking if she had read anything new and whether she would tell him about it when he arrived. Helen read the letter 3 times, then folded it with great care and put it in the drawer of her bedside table where she kept the things that mattered most to her. She wrote back that evening. She wrote him about Middlemarch's ending, which she said she would not fully spoil but which she thought he would find satisfying. She wrote him about a new book of poetry she had received from the Austin bookseller, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which she thought was one of the most honest things ever put to paper. She wrote that the prairie in December had a beauty of its own that she did not think was recognized often enough by the people living in it, a kind of stripped-down clarity. She wrote that she was looking forward to the spring. She had not, she realized after she sealed the letter, looked forward to a particular season in several years. They exchanged 3 more letters through the winter. His grew longer as his writing became more confident, and hers grew less formal as she stopped editing herself for an audience and started writing the way she talked. He told her about a night in January when he had seen the aurora borealis from the North Texas plains, which was rare enough to feel like a message, though he could not have said from whom. She told him about the day in February when she read 3 chapters of Middlemarch aloud to old Doc Prentice, who had a bad lung and could not read for himself that week, and how the reading had felt different with a listener fuller, somehow, as though the words expanded in shared space. He wrote back, "I think that is why stories exist. Not to be held alone, but to pass between people." She read that line 5 times and thought that it was one of the most beautiful things she had ever encountered, and that she had encountered quite a few beautiful things. He arrived in April of 1879 with the Dunmore outfit's spring drive, 10 months after he had first ridden into Redrock with a split lip and a tired horse. He rode down the main street and turned onto Sycamore and stopped in front of her house and knocked, and she opened the door in her everyday dress with her hair half out of its braid and a copy of Leaves of Grass in her hand, and she looked at him and said, "You are a day early." "The weather was good," he said. "We made better time." "Come in," she said. "I just made coffee." He came in, and the front room with its shelved walls was exactly as he had left it, and it felt absurdly like arriving somewhere rather than visiting. He sat at the table and she poured coffee and sat in her reading chair and she said, "Tell me what you have been reading." He pulled a book from under his coat, a thin collected volume of short stories that Mrs. Cross had given him, which he had finished twice. He put it on the table between them. "I read this one through twice," he said. "The story called The Outcasts of Poker Flat. I thought it was remarkable." She picked it up and examined it. "Bret Harte," she said. "He writes the West as it really is. Most writers from the East make it either too wild or too romantic." She looked at the story he had mentioned. "What did you find remarkable about it?" "The way it does not sentimentalize the characters," he said. "They are not good people exactly, but you feel the tragedy of them anyway. You mourn them." She looked at him across the table with those gray eyes, and something in them had changed from the first April. They were warmer, more open. The steady wall of self-containment she carried had thinned where it faced him. "Marcus," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "Yes," he said. "I am glad you came back," she said. "Helen," he said, and her name felt like the book she had given him, like something offered with both hands. "I have not stopped thinking about this house and the person in it since October." She held the Bret Harte book with both hands and looked at the cover and then back at him and said, "I would like to continue this, whatever this is." "So would I," he said. "Very much." The Dunmore outfit was in Redrock for 6 days that spring, and Marcus spent every evening at Helen's house. They read together. She read aloud, and then he read aloud, his voice slower than hers but steadier than it had been, and she never rushed him or corrected him except when he asked. They talked about the books and about their own lives with the comfortable urgency of people who have only recently found that words can be fully trusted between them. He told her about his father and the farm, and what it meant to come from a place where reading was a luxury no one had time for. She listened without the kind of well-meaning sympathy that feels like condescension, and instead said, "Learning a thing later does not mean you are less entitled to it. It means you wanted it enough to seek it out." "You do not think less of me for it," he said. "I think more of you for it," she said. "It takes courage to admit what you do not have and pursue it." He looked at her and thought about the way she had offered to help him with the ledger that first afternoon in April of last year, casually, without diminishment, and thought that she had seen the gap in him and moved toward it rather than away, and that this was not a small thing. Redrock, meanwhile, was adjusting its opinion of Helen Wells with the reluctant, slowly turning gearwork of a community confronting inconvenient evidence. The trail boss from the Dunmore outfit, who was by all accounts a capable and respected man, called on her every evening. He sat in her house and came out looking settled and unhurried, and not at all as though he had been subjected to something strange. Millicent Pryor still sniffed, but even she said to her sister Agnes that she supposed books were not entirely the problem she had taken them for if a man like that did not seem to mind them. Margaret Aldine said to Helen one morning with the frankness of a true friend, "He is going to ask you something before the outfit leaves. I would prepare yourself." "Prepare myself how?" Helen asked. "By knowing your answer," Margaret said. Helen thought about her answer all day, bent over her mending at the kitchen table, and found that she knew it with a clarity that surprised her only in how unsurprising it was. On the fifth evening, Marcus stayed later than usual. The fire had burned down to embers and they had set aside the books and were sitting in the comfortable silence that had become as natural between them as conversation. The wind was up outside, moving through the mesquite, and the lamp made the room warm and separate from the dark. "I will be in Abilene by June," he said. "Wichita in July, back south through Oklahoma in October." "I know the route," she said. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, the way he said things he had turned over many times before speaking, "about whether a trail boss is a reasonable life for a man who wants something more settled." She looked at him. "Dunmore has offered me a position at the home ranch in the fall," he said, "near San Angelo, managing the operation from there. I have been putting off the answer." He paused. "I think I have been waiting to know if there was a reason to settle." The fire crackled once. Outside, the mesquite bent in the wind. "Is there?" she asked quietly. "I believe so," he said, "if she would have me." Helen looked at the embers and then at him, at the serious, weathered face, and the dark eyes that held something she had not seen in them that first April, a kind of open vulnerability, a willingness to be seen fully, which she knew cost him something because it had cost her the same thing to offer it. "I would have you," she said. "I would very much have you." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat that way in the dying firelight while the wind talked in the mesquite trees outside, and it was not dramatic in any visible way, but it was one of the most important moments that had ever happened in that small house on Sycamore Street. He kissed her on the porch when he left, brief and deliberate, her face tipped up in the cold night air around them, and the stars over Redrock blazing in the way they did in the open Texas sky with no smoke or industry to dim them. She stood on the porch step and watched him walk back down Sycamore Street and did not go inside for a long time after. He asked her properly 2 mornings later, before the outfit left, in the front room with the morning light on the bookshelves and her coffee growing cold on the table between them. He had no ring yet. There was not time to get one properly in Redrock, and he told her so plainly that he would send for one from San Antonio if she accepted, and that if she would prefer to wait until fall when he had the home ranch position secured, he would understand completely. "I do not need a ring to answer," she said, "and I do not need to wait until fall." Looked at him across the table. "Yes, Marcus Walden, I will marry you." He let out a breath that seemed to have been held for approximately 10 months. "I will come back in October," he said. "We can be married then here in Redrock if that is where you want to be." "Here," she said. "I would like to be married here." He rode out with the Dunmore outfit that morning, and Pete Calhoun, who had somehow intuited the whole of it, said nothing at all, which was the greatest kindness he had ever done anyone. The months between April and October were the longest of Helen's life, and also, she thought later, some of the best. She had purpose and certainty now that sat differently than the quiet contentment she had built alone, a warmth in the future that made the present days richer rather than diminishing them. She continued her sewing and mending, continued to read, continued to have her afternoon coffee with Margaret Walden and her occasional evenings with Doc Prentice. She also packed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but carefully and thoughtfully, setting aside what she would take to San Angelo, what she would sell, what she would give away. The house could be let. There was a young couple who had been looking for something on Sycamore Street. She would take the books. Obviously, she would take all the books. She received 6 more letters from Marcus through the summer. He wrote from Abilene, Wichita, Dodge City, various points south. His writing had grown confident and fluent, and the letters were long. He wrote about the trail and the weather and the country, but he also wrote about the books he was reading, because he had taken to carrying one constantly and reading at every opportunity. He wrote that he had started Middlemark and found it as remarkable as she had promised. He wrote that Dorothea's stubbornness in the face of a world that wanted her smaller was one of the most affecting things he had read. He wrote that he understood now why she had a whole room of books, because once the door was open you could not imagine shutting it again. She read that last line and smiled so broadly that Margaret Walden, who happened to be visiting, asked her what the letter said, and Helen read her the line, and Margaret said, "He is exactly right and also exactly what I hoped he would be." Marcus also wrote about the conversation he had with Dunmore in Abilene. The home ranch position was confirmed. He would be managing the San Angelo operation from November. It was good work, reliable work, with a proper house on the property and a wage that would support a family without difficulty. He wrote this practically, with numbers and facts, and then at the end of that particular letter he added in slightly larger handwriting, "I find I have developed a great deal of hope about the future and I thought you should know." She wrote back, "So have I." He arrived in Redrock on the 12th of October, 1879, one day before she expected him, because the weather was good and he had pushed the last stretch. She was on the porch when she heard the cattle and stood up from her chair, and she walked to the gate and watched the head of the herd come down the main street in the afternoon dust, and she found Marcus Walden at the front of the outfit, sitting straight in the saddle with the October sun on his face, and he saw her at the gate and turned his horse towards Sycamore Street before the herd was even fully through. He stopped at the gate and looked down at her. He had sent the ring from San Antonio in August, a plain gold band with a small garnet, which she had been wearing on a ribbon around her neck, because it seemed premature to wear it on her hand before the wedding. She had it there now under her collar. "I made good time," he said. "You always do," she said. He swung down from the horse and stood in front of her in the October afternoon and looked at her the way he had looked at the Jane Eyre in October of the previous year, with the focused attention of someone who recognizes something irreplaceable. "Are you ready?" he asked. "For what specifically?" she said, teasing slightly. "For all of it," he said. "For getting married and leaving Redrock and having a house in San Angelo and whatever comes after that." "Yes," she said. "I have been ready since April of last year, I think." He took her hand and she let him, and they stood in the gate of her house on Sycamore Street, while the last of the Dunmore outfit trailed past in a great dusty river of longhorns, and the mesquite bent in the autumn wind, and it felt like the end of a very long beginning. They were married on the 21st of October, 1879, in the church on Main Street, which was both a practical choice and a mild social statement, because the church meant it was public and official and witnessed by Redrock, and Redrock had to sit in its pews and watch Helen Wells, peculiar book-reading Helen Wells, marry a solid and respected trail boss who looked at her the way the church windows looked at the morning light. Reverend Moore performed the service with economy and grace. Margaret Walden stood up as Helen's witness, teary and smiling in equal measure. Pete Calhoun stood for Marcus, having cleaned up so thoroughly for the occasion that 3 people failed to recognize him. Doc Prentice sat in the second pew with his hands folded and looked satisfied, as though he had known all along and had simply been waiting for the rest of them to catch up. Helen wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that Margaret had helped her remake from an older gown, and she had her hair properly pinned for once, and she looked, by every account in Redrock, beautiful in the way of a woman who has never needed the word applied to her, and therefore does not arrange herself to receive it. She moved down the aisle with her shoulders straight and her eyes on Marcus, who was standing at the front in his best clothes, looking as though someone had handed him the thing he had not known he had been asking for. The ring went from the ribbon around her neck to her finger during the ceremony, and Marcus spoke his vows in the measured way he said important things, slow and clear and meaning every word, and Helen spoke hers with the same directness she brought to everything. And when Reverend Moore pronounced them married, there was a warmth in the church that went beyond the wood stove. After the service, Margaret had organized a modest gathering at the hotel dining room, and Redrock turned out in numbers that suggested the community's opinion of Helen Wells had shifted more than anyone had publicly admitted. Even Millicent Pryor appeared, having brought a jar of preserved peaches, and said to Helen with the careful dignity of a woman performing a social correction, "You look very well, Mrs. Walden," and Helen accepted this gracefully because she was happy and happiness is generous. They stayed 2 more nights in Redrock. Marcus had arrangements to complete with the Dunmore outfit before he formally transitioned to the home ranch role, and spent those evenings in the house on Sycamore Street, which was still hers until the young couple on the waiting list took possession. On the first evening, Marcus sat in the chair at her table and she sat in her reading chair, and she opened Leaves of Grass and read him Whitman by lamplight, and the words moved through the warm room like water, and he sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on her face, and listened with the particular attention of a man who has learned that listening is not passive, but a form of presence. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Read me that one again, the one about containing multitudes." She did. He listened with his eyes closed, and when she finished the second time, he said, "I think that is the most honest line ever written." "Do you contradict yourself?" she asked. "Constantly," he said, and the way he said it was fond rather than troubled, as though the contradictions in himself had finally found the company of someone who did not require him to resolve them. On the morning of the 24th of October, they left Redrock. Helen's books went in a wagon that Marcus had arranged 2 large crates, carefully packed with paper between the volumes, and the young couple who took the house stood on the porch as the wagon pulled away and watched with the mild curiosity of people inheriting someone else's history. Margaret Aldine stood at the gate of her millinery shop and waved, and Helen put her hand up in return and kept it up until the shop was a small point, and then nothing at all. The road south and west toward San Angelo was 2 days of travel, and they made camp the first night beside a shallow creek that ran amber over flat limestone, and Marcus built a fire and she made coffee in the camp pot she had packed, and they sat on either side of the fire while the Texas stars came out in their multitudes. "Are you sorry to leave?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which she always did. "A little," she said. "The house, Margaret, Doc Prentice," she looked at the fire. "But I have been in Redrock my whole life, and I think I have always known I was too large for it, not in a proud way, just in the way of something that does not quite fit its container." "San Angelo is a proper town," he said, "bigger than Redrock, more variety." "Does it have a bookshop?" she asked. He smiled, which was something that happened more readily on his face now than it had a year ago. "It does," he said. "I made a point of noting that." She looked at him across the fire. "You investigated the bookshop situation before proposing to me." "I investigated several practical matters," he said solemnly. "The bookshop was near the top of the list." She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she had rarely used in Redrock because there had not often been a sufficient cause for it, and the sound of it went out into the night prairie and dispersed among the stars, and Marcus Walden looked at her across the fire with the frank and settled certainty of a man who has arrived exactly where he intended to be. The Dunmore home ranch outside San Angelo was larger than Helen had pictured, a working operation of considerable size, with cattle pens and a main barn and several outbuildings, and the manager's house that now belonged to them, a proper frame house with 4 rooms and a porch that faced west toward a view of the rolling prairie that in the evening turned every color that fire turns. Helen spent the first week establishing the house, unpacking the book crates first, obviously, arranging the shelves in the front room that became the library, setting her reading chair by the window. Marcus watched her unpack the books with the expression of a man who has agreed to something fully and finds, upon its arrival, that his agreement was correct. "That is a great many books," he said on the second day, surveying the shelves she had filled. "There will be more," she said pleasantly. "I have an arrangement with a bookseller in Austin." "I know," he said. "I am counting on it." She turned and looked at him. "Are you?" "I have approximately 4 years of reading to catch up on," he said. "At my current pace, if you acquire books at your standard rate, we will reach equilibrium sometime around 1885. She stared at him. Then she said, "That is the most mathematical thing you have ever said to me." "Pete Calhoun pointed out that I had developed a talent for planning," he said. She laughed again and went back to her shelving, and Marcus sat down in what was becoming his chair at the table, and pulled out the copy of Middlemarch he was working through, and read in comfortable silence while she arranged the room around him. The life they built at the San Angelo ranch was not without its difficulties, because no life is, but the difficulties were the manageable kind. The kind that 2 people who respect each other and communicate honestly can navigate without losing each other in the process. Marcus's work was demanding. Managing a ranch operation of that scale required long days and constant judgment, and he came in tired most evenings. But he never came in too tired to sit with her in the front room, and she read to him on the evenings when his eyes would not track the page, and on the easier evenings he read to her, his voice steady and sure now, moving through the words with an ease that still moved her when she thought about the distance he had traveled to arrive at it. He started bringing books home from San Angelo's bookshop himself, in the spring of 1880, appearing one evening with a brown paper parcel, not unlike the one she had been carrying when they first collided in front of the Redrock post office. She unwrapped it and found a copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which was 4 years old but which she had not yet managed to obtain, and she looked at him over the book with shining eyes. "The bookseller said it was good for a laugh," he said, somewhat defensively. "It is perfect," she said. "Come and sit down. I am reading it to you directly." She read him the first 4 chapters that evening, and he laughed 3 times, which was remarkable because he was not a man who laughed frequently, and each time the laughter surprised him slightly, as though his own amusement was a new country he had not mapped. In the summer of 1880, Helen realized she was expecting. She told Marcus on a June evening when the sun was going down behind the prairie, and the porch caught the last warm light, and she simply said, "I believe we are going to have a child," and his face did something complicated and comprehensive that she had never seen it do before, a kind of complete opening, all the careful composure dissolving for a moment into something that could only be called joy. He put his hand over hers on the porch rail, and held it there for a long time without speaking. "Are you well?" he asked finally. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said, and then, after a pause, "We will need more shelves." She looked at him sideways. "For the child." "For the books we will read to the child," he said. "Starting early seems advisable." She put her head against his shoulder, and they watched the sun complete its descent, and the prairie turned from gold to gray to the deep blue of a Texas summer dusk, and Helen Wells, who was now Helen Walden, though she thought of herself as both, the same person only expanded, felt something that she had struggled to feel in Redrock even in her best moments, a sense of being fully in the right place at the right time, of her life's shape finally matching the shape of herself. Their son was born in March of 1881, in the manager's house at the San Angelo Ranch, with the help of the town's doctor and Margaret Aldine, who had made the journey from Redrock specifically because Helen had written and asked her to come. He was a healthy and vocal boy, with Marcus's dark eyes and his mother's habit of watching everything with measuring calm, and they named him Thomas, for Helen's father. Marcus Walden, who had spent his adult life keeping his emotions at arm's length as a matter of professional survival, held his son for the first time and did not bother to manage what his face did. Helen, exhausted and radiant in the particular way of women who have just done one of the most extraordinary things a person can do, watched him hold the baby and felt something so full and warm that she could not have contained it in words, though she would eventually try in the letter she wrote to Doc Prentice the following week. Thomas Walden was read to from birth. Marcus established this practice before the baby was 3 weeks old, sitting with him in the evening while Helen rested, reading aloud from whatever was to hand Whitman sometimes, Tom Sawyer sometimes, once an entire section of a cattle almanac, because it was the nearest book when Thomas was fussy at 3 in the morning. Helen said the variety was educational. Marcus said the cattle almanac had actually seemed to help. By the time Thomas was old enough to ask for stories by pointing at the shelves with imperious infant authority, the library at the San Angelo house had expanded to 3 additional shelves built by Marcus on a quiet Sunday, and Helen had a standing order with both the Austin bookseller and now one in San Antonio. A visiting neighbor once surveyed the front room and said to Marcus, with the tone of a person pointing out a peculiarity, "That is quite a lot of books." "It is," Marcus said, with a satisfaction that closed the subject entirely. In the spring of 1883, Marcus was approached by a land investor named Cartwright who had a parcel outside of San Angelo that he was selling at a reasonable price, 40 acres of good grazing land with water access and a small existing structure. Marcus brought the proposition to Helen on a Sunday, laying out the map on the kitchen table. "He wants to sell and leave Texas," Marcus said. "The price is fair. With what we have saved and a note from the bank, we could manage it." Helen looked at the map. She had learned to read maps Marcus had taught her, returning the favor in a fashion, and she could see the logic of the land, the way the water access worked, and where the grazing would be strongest. "Is this what you want?" she asked. "Your own operation?" He looked at the map. "I have been managing someone else's land for 4 years," he said. "I am good at it. I think I could be better at my own." "Then yes," she said, "we do it." He looked up. "You did not need to think about it longer." "I thought about it," she said. "It took approximately 4 seconds. You have been careful and honest with money since before I knew you, and you know this land as well as anyone." And she tapped the map. "There is room to build a proper house." He raised an eyebrow. "With a library." "With a substantial library," she confirmed. The purchase went through in May of 1883. They spent that summer in the building, Marcus overseeing the construction crew, Helen managing the household through the disruption with the equanimity that was her particular genius. And Thomas, now 2 years old, investigated everything with the focused intensity of a child who has been read to constantly and has developed ideas about how things ought to work. The new house was finished in October, a proper frame house with a proper porch facing west, and a front room with shelves built floor to ceiling on 2 full walls, which Marcus had specified without being asked. Helen stood in the empty room before the books were moved in and put her hand on the shelves, and felt a kind of rightness that was not unlike the feeling of starting a particularly fine book. The sense of space made ready for something. They moved the books in on a Saturday, she and Marcus, and a willing ranch hand named Ezra who had worked for them since the previous year. Ezra, who was 22 and had grown up on the frontier with a limited experience of books, watched the crates being unpacked with an expression of honest astonishment. "Is that all of them?" he asked when the 4th crate was opened. "There are 2 more in the wagon," Helen said. Ezra looked at Marcus, who said, "We are readers," with a finality that Ezra wisely accepted. Margaret Aldine came from Redrock for 3 days to see the new house in November of 1883, and walked through every room with the thorough appreciation of a woman who had been the friend of the house's owner long enough to understand what all of it meant. She spent 20 minutes in the library room alone, taking in the shelves. "Your father would have been very pleased," she said to Helen when she came out. Helen looked at the shelves. "I know," she said. "I think that every time I look at them." Doc Prentice, whose bad lung had kept him from traveling since 1881, wrote a letter that Helen received in December of 1883, a long and warm letter about what he called the particular satisfaction of watching someone live exactly as they should. He had, he said, never had any doubt that Helen Wells's life would eventually make proper sense of itself, but he was glad to see the timeline had not been unreasonably extended. He also sent a book, a new edition of Walt Whitman, expanded, with an inscription in his shaky old man's hand, "For the best reader in Texas and the cowboy who had the sense to listen." Helen read the inscription aloud to Marcus that evening, and Marcus looked at it for a long moment. "He is not wrong about the listening," he said. "You were not just listening," she said. "You were learning. There is a difference." He looked at her. "From the first moment you described a book to me in the dry goods store," he said, "I was paying a different kind of attention than I had paid to anything before." She set the book on her knee. "What kind of attention?" "The kind where the thing you are attending to has become the most important thing in the room," he said quietly. "And you know, even while it is happening, that the importance is going to be permanent." Helen looked at her husband, at the serious, weathered reading man who had ridden into Redrock dusty and closed off and had opened by degrees, not because she had asked him to, but because she had simply been there, consistent and herself, and he had found that what she was made him want to be more of what he was, and she felt the full, settled, wordless happiness of a woman who has found the exact right thing and knows it. Thomas, who was 2.5 and had been supposedly asleep, appeared in the doorway of the library with his blanket and said, with the commanding authority of a toddler who knows his parents respond to specific requests, "Book." "You are supposed to be asleep," Marcus said. "Book," Thomas repeated with emphasis. Helen looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Thomas. Then Marcus stood up and went to the shelf and ran his finger along the spines until he found the thin volume of Bret Harte's short stories that he still kept there. And he picked up Thomas and sat back in his chair with the boy on his lap, and he opened the book and began to read. His voice in the lamplight was steady and warm, moving through the words without hesitation, and Thomas leaned against his father's chest and listened with the drowsy, receptive attention of a child who has been listening to stories since before he could understand them, and therefore understands them in some way that runs deeper than comprehension. Helen sat in her reading chair and watched them. The fire in the grate, the shelves on the walls, the October wind in whatever trees were near enough to hear. Her husband reading to their son with a fluency that had been earned slowly and willingly over the course of 2 years of determined effort. A man who had come to books late and loved them completely, who had asked her to read to him and then learned to read himself, who had built her a room for her library without being asked and called it necessary. She thought about the version of herself that had sat on the porch in Redrock watching the sun set over the flat horizon, feeling the loneliness of a person whose language no one nearby spoke. She felt great tenderness for that woman, and great gratitude that the story had not ended there, as it so easily might have. In the spring of 1884, Helen told Marcus she was expecting again. He received this news with the same comprehensive joy he had brought to the first announcement, and added with absolute seriousness, "We will need to extend the shelves." "The child is not yet born," she said. "Early preparation," he said. Their daughter, Clara Louise Walden, was born in November of 1884, with the same dark eyes as her brother and a disposition from birth that suggested she was going to form opinions early and hold them with conviction. Marcus held her with the practiced ease of a man who had been holding Thomas for 3 years, and looked at her with an expression that Helen recognized as the same one he had worn looking at the Jane Eyre she had given him on that October porch in 1878. A person recognizing something irreplaceable. Thomas, now 3 years old, was initially uncertain about the new arrival, but warmed considerably when Helen read to them both simultaneously, and he was able to confirm that Clara also listened attentively, which he apparently found acceptable. The Walden Ranch grew steadily through the 1880s. Not extravagantly, but solidly, the way things grow when they are managed with patience and knowledge. Marcus hired 3 permanent hands, including Ezra, who had by 1885 begun borrowing books from the library room and had discovered that he had a particular affinity for history. Helen did not say, "I told you so," about this because she was gracious, but her satisfaction was visible to anyone who knew her face. She had also, by 1885, begun something she had not anticipated. She was teaching. It started with Ezra and the other 2 hands simple enough, as they were willing adults, but it spread, because word travels in a ranch community, and by the following spring there were 4 children from neighboring properties who came to the Walden house twice a week for what Helen called simply reading lessons, but which covered arithmetic, geography, some history, and whatever book was currently holding her interest. Marcus built a long table for the lessons, setting it up in the library room, and he sometimes sat at the back with his own book while Helen taught, not to supervise, but because he liked being in the room when it was full of people learning to read. He understood the specific dignity of that particular accomplishment in a way that made his presence quiet and unobtrusive and somehow encouraging. One of the children, a girl of 8 named Ruth, whose family had come to Texas from Georgia 3 years prior, was initially very resistant to reading, insisting it was not useful and not interesting. Helen recognized the resistance as a form of self-protection. The girl was afraid of failing and did not push directly. Instead, she read aloud to the whole group every session, and she chose stories with the same consideration she gave to everything she loved. One afternoon she read them the opening of Jane Eyre. Ruth sat up. By the following week Ruth was asking to borrow the book, and by the month's end she had read the first 5 chapters with the fierce independence of a converted skeptic. Helen handed her the book to keep and felt something that she thought was probably what her father had felt every time he came home with something new from Austin and San Antonio. In the winter of 1886, a letter arrived from Pete Calhoun, which surprised Marcus because Pete was not a man given to correspondence. The letter was brief and written in the blunt style of a man who had not spent his summer in Wichita with a widow schoolteacher. It said that the Dunmore outfit was disbanding. Old man Dunmore had died and the family was selling the operation, and that Pete was heading to New Mexico to try his luck, and that he wished Marcus well, and that he had to say it had been a pleasure watching him get situated, which was Pete's word for everything from settled to transformed by love, and that the woman Marcus had married was, in Pete's estimation, better than anyone deserved, but Marcus in particular deserved her, so it worked out fine. Marcus read this letter 3 times and then read it aloud to Helen, who laughed at the conclusion and said, "Pete Calhoun is a man of hidden depths." "Do not tell him," Marcus said. "It would embarrass him." He wrote Pete back a proper letter, 2 full pages, which would have astonished Pete Calhoun of 1878 into silence, and it contained, among other things, the news that the library at the Walden Ranch had grown to fill 1.5 walls, and that Helen was teaching reading to 6 children now, and that Thomas at 5 years old could read simple texts himself, and that Clara at age 1 was already demonstrating strong opinions about which books she preferred being read, which Helen took as an encouraging sign. The spring of 1887 brought a drought that hit the San Angelo area hard, and the Walden Ranch felt it along with everyone else. Pasture going brown earlier than it should, water sources dropping, cattle requiring supplemental feed that ate into the year's margins. It was a difficult year, and Marcus managed it with the same measured attention he brought to good years, without panic and without despair, which Helen thought was one of his most important qualities. The ability to face difficulty without being broken by it, and without pretending it was not there. They did not lose the ranch. They came through the drought year leaner but intact, and the following year the rain returned and the pasture came back, and by 1888 the operation was back to its previous footing. Marcus, sitting on the porch in the October of 1888 with coffee and the end of the book he had been reading, a history of the Texas frontier that Helen had brought home from San Angelo, said, "The difficult years teach you what holds." "And what holds?" she asked. He looked at the ranch, at the cattle on the distant pasture, at the house with the lamplight beginning to come on in the front windows, where their children were presumably getting into the books they were not supposed to touch without asking. "This," he said, "all of this." She sat beside him on the porch bench, and the October evening came down around them in the particular colors of the Texas autumn, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder, and they stayed there until Clara called from inside for one of them to come and sort out an argument about which book Thomas had promised to read her, and had then reneged on. Thomas and Clara grew up in the library room. They read everything on the shelves with the indiscriminate enthusiasm of children who have never been told that some books are not for them. Whitman and Dickens and Bret Harte and George Eliot, the almanacs, the histories, the novels, the poetry. Thomas developed a particular fondness for history and geography, and by age 10 could tell you more about the settlement of the American West than most adults in Tom Green County. Clara favored stories and poetry, and by age 8 was composing her own verses in a notebook that she kept with proprietary severity in her room. Marcus read to them when they asked, and with them when they wanted company, and alongside them when everyone simply needed to be in the same room doing the same thing. Helen sometimes looked at the four of them in the library room, Marcus in his chair, Thomas on the floor with something large and illustrated, Clara in the small chair Marcus had built for her specifically, and felt the full expansion of what a single conversation in a dry goods store had made possible. In the winter of 1889, they received word that Doc Prentice had died. He had gone quietly, his housekeeper reported, in his reading chair with a book in his lap. He left Helen a letter that had clearly been written some time before, in the steady hand she remembered, telling her that she had been one of the finest things in a long life that had contained many fine things, and that he had never worried about her because she had always known herself well enough to find what she needed, even when the finding took a little time. Helen cried when she read this, a private, full crying, the kind that honors rather than mourns. And then she went to the library room and found the copy of Mark Twain that Doc Prentice had left on her porch all those years ago in Redrock. And she held it for a while and thought about the people who make you possible by believing in you before you have given them sufficient reason. She told Thomas and Clara about Doc Prentice that evening at supper, and Thomas, who was 8 years old and already possessed of his mother's directness, asked what kind of man he had been. Helen said he had been the kind of man who leaves books on people's porches because he understands that books are a form of companionship, and that such men were rare and should be remembered clearly. "Is that why we have so many books?" Clara asked. "Partly," Helen said, "and partly because your father built shelves that can hold a great many, and it seemed wrong not to fill them." Marcus, across the table, said nothing, but the look he gave her over the children's heads was the same look he had given her in the dry goods store in Redrock in 1878, when she described Jane Eyre to him. The look of a man attending to something that has become permanently important, and she returned it with the full warmth of a woman who has been attended to in that particular way for more than a decade, and finds it still as moving as the first time. The 1890s came to the Walden Ranch with the gradual changes that come everywhere, as the frontier settled into something more like a region than a wilderness. San Angelo grew and developed. The railroad came through in 1888 and changed the cattle business considerably, reducing the need for long trail drives. Marcus adapted the ranch operation accordingly, as he adapted most things with attention and without nostalgia for the way things had been, because the way things had been had also contained hardship, and he was not inclined to romance hardship. The library room gained a third wall of shelves in 1891, and Helen placed in the topmost shelf all the books that had been with her longest: the Dickens from Redrock, the Whitman with Doc Prentice's inscription, the Jane Eyre she had given Marcus in 1878, and which he had returned to its place on the shelf when he came back to her in the fall, and beside it the copy of Bret Harte that Mrs. Eleanor Cross had given him in Wichita on the summer he learned to read. She put those books high up where they would be safe and visible, and where she could look at them and know the whole story they told about the distance between a gray April morning in 1878 and the warm library room of 1891. Thomas, at 11, had taken to writing in addition to reading. He kept a journal of observations about the ranch, the weather, the behavior of the cattle, and he had the habit of reading his journal entries aloud to whoever was nearby, which was so precisely like his mother that Marcus said so on a Sunday afternoon, and Helen looked delighted. "He has your application," she told Marcus. "He works at the writing the way you worked at the reading." "Maybe," Marcus said. "But the way he talks about the land sounds like you." She looked at the window, at the late afternoon light on the pasture. "Maybe it sounds like both of us," she said. He considered this. "That is the best possible outcome," he said. Clara, at 7, had taken to the lessons Helen still held twice a week, now teaching 7 children from the neighboring properties, with the authority of a child who considers herself the resident expert. She had opinions about Helen's methods that she shared freely, and Helen received them with the seriousness due a thoughtful critic. Marcus, watching this exchange once, said quietly to Ezra, who was nearby, "That child is her mother exactly." And Ezra, who had been on the ranch long enough to know them all well, said, "Yes, sir, but she has also got some of you in the way she holds her ground." Marcus thought about that and found it pleased him tremendously. In the summer of 1892, Ruth, the girl who had resisted reading and then converted fiercely, came to tell Helen that she had been accepted to a teacher training program in Austin. She was 17 now, tall and serious, and she stood on the porch of the Walden house with her hat in her hands and told Helen that she would not be the kind of woman she wanted to be without the reading lessons, and the library room, and the woman who had read her the opening of Jane Eyre on a January afternoon when she had decided she was not the sort of person stories were for. Helen listened to all of this and then said, "You were always the sort of person stories were for. You just needed someone to make it clear." Ruth left for Austin in September, and Helen watched the wagon go with her hand on the porch rail and thought about her father bringing books back from Austin and San Antonio, and about the way generosity, offered honestly, travels forward in ways you cannot fully predict. Marcus came to stand beside her, and she leaned into him, and he put his arm around her shoulder, and they watched the road until the wagon was gone. "You have given that girl something that will be with her all her life," he said. "So did your father," she said quietly, "by bringing you to the frontier where you would eventually ride into Redrock with a split lip and knock a woman over in front of the post office." He looked at her sideways. "I did not knock you over. You walked into me. You were not watching your footing." "I was reading a book," she said. "You are always reading a book," he said. "And yet," she said. "And yet," he said, and pressed a kiss to her temple with the unhurried certainty of a man who has been doing this for 13 years and plans to be doing it for considerably more. They went back inside, into the library room where the shelves held all the books they had read and all the ones waiting, where Thomas's journal was open on the floor and Clara's poetry notebook was on the small chair and Marcus's current book was face down on the side table, and Helen's copy of Middlemarch, the third copy she had owned, the first 2 having been read to pieces, was on the arm of her reading chair. The evening light came through the window in the long amber way of Texas autumn light and lay across the floorboards and the book spines and the braided rug. And it was, by any accounting, a full and beautiful room. Helen sat in her chair and picked up Middlemark and opened to her place, and Marcus sat at his table and opened his book. And for a while they simply read in the same room, in the same comfortable silence that had always been between them. Not the lonesome silence she had sat in on the porch in Redrock watching the sun go down, but the inhabited silence of two people who have found each other, and do not need to fill every moment with words, because the important ones have already been said. And the more important ones are still being said, in every book read together, every evening spent in the same lamplight, every story shared in the long and continuing conversation that had begun when a dusty trail boss picked up a woman's book parcel from the Redrock street and asked her if it was a good book. It was, she had told him. She hoped so at any rate. She had not started it yet. She had started it. And everything since then had been the answer to his question. Better, she thought, turning the page in her reading chair while the Texas evening came down, and her children argued amicably in the next room, and her husband read quietly at the table. Better than any ending she had thought to hope for in the quiet years before he came, because it was not an ending at all but a life, continuous and full. With shelves still being built, and books still arriving, and stories still being read aloud in the warm, particular light of a room made for exactly this purpose.